So as we head to peak oil, the global economy is beginning to stall. Prices are going up for everything.
The end of the oil age will push many people on the globe into misery, into hunger, and maybe into possible death.
Represent a real threat to the whole world.
If these glaciers keep melting, they will eventually disappear, and there will be no ice melt to sustain rivers like the Ganges.
We need to begin to wean ourselves off the old energies, move to the renewable energies, create a distributed power revolution.
Everything boils down to energy.
We do know how to produce energy sustainably.
It won't be just one energy source that we can rely on.
Solar and wind and geothermal.
So I would urge caution in exploring the nuclear option.
Our species is in peril. Our fellow creatures are facing extinction. This is a turning point for the human race.
Everybody has been worried the last few years about the rising energy prices, the scarcity of oil. There is a widespread belief that the world is running out of oil, called peak oil theory.
We are now on the cusp of what we call peak oil. Peak oil is when half the world's oil reserves are used up.
Peak oil is on our doorstep, and it's not likely to increase much beyond where it already is.
Once we peak and half the oil is used up, the prices are unaffordable.
This will have a strangulating effect, in particular on poor countries.
The most affected are the poor because food prices are going through the roof.
The scramble for the last remaining reserves will in a way color and penetrate other conflicts which are there in the world and will accelerate and sharpen these other conflicts.
Many geologists think world oil production peaked last year. Others think it's peaking this year. Some think it'll peak a few years from now.
Now, the optimists say maybe we move to peak oil by around 2025, 2030. But now, a growing number of pessimists, some of the greatest geologists in the world, using new computer simulation studies, modeling with the gas and oil reserve figures, and the new studies suggest we could peak as early as 2010 to 2020.
If you look at the largest oil fields ever discovered, and you look at the list of the 20 largest oil fields, the first one was discovered in 1914, the last one in 1979. This means that the youngest of the large oil fields is now nearly 30 years old. So we're in a situation where production in almost all the major oil fields is going down, and new discoveries are no longer offsetting this. The Russians announced early this year that their oil production probably peaked in the last quarter of last year.
So when do we peak? I don't know who's right, the pessimists or the optimists, but it really makes very little difference. The geologists are only arguing among themselves about 10 or 15 years. Do we peak between 2010 and 2020, like the pessimists say, or 2020 to 2030 or 35, like the optimists? Regardless, the geologists are only arguing about 10 or 15 years here. This is a very short window to change the entire energy regime and the whole infrastructure based on it and all the economies that are derived from it in the world.
And that will be a very different world than the one in which we have spent our lifetimes. Because throughout our lifetimes, world oil production has always been rising, going up, up, up. I mean, occasionally there's some blips along the way, but basically we have spent our lives in a world of rising oil production. This is about to end, and I don't think the world is at all prepared.
The first consequence will be, of course, that oil becomes more expensive,
Once we peak and half the oil is used up, the prices are unaffordable. And now, it may trough down. There'll be spikes and troughs. Maybe it'll go down to 90, but the next spike will be 175. Then it may trough down to 150. Then it's going to go to 200.
The first is a rise in prices will send a wave of price increase throughout the economy. What happens is that, shortly speaking, life will become more expensive.
We grow our food and petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides, our plastics, our building materials, our pharmaceutical products, our power, our transport, our heat, our light, most of our clothes. It's all derived from fossil fuels. So as we head to peak oil, the global economy is beginning to stall.
Or if you look at the economic projections by the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, they show the economy continuing to grow at a rather rapid rate from now until mid-century, without realizing that when oil production peaks, and it is peaking sooner rather than later, that this rapid growth is not going to be possible.
Prices are going up for everything, and the real divide, the real tragedy, is that the most affected are the poor because food prices are going through the roof. Cereal, grains, and food prices have doubled across the world.
The end of the oil age will push many people on the globe into misery, into hunger, and maybe into possible death. It will therefore exclude sizable numbers of people from transport, from fertilized food production, pharmaceuticals, and so on and so forth.
For most of these people, upwards of half or more of their income goes to food. So as oil prices have gone up toward peak oil, food prices have doubled for things like wheat and rice, and we now have 200 million people hungry on the border of starvation.
And desperate people do desperate things. They riot, they pillage, they overthrow their governments. Stresses lead to ethnic conflicts, to genocide, racial conflicts, religious conflicts.
And we have food riots and demonstrations all over the world in at least 30 countries.
The same thing what happens to private consumers as they drive up to the gasoline station and are terrified. The same thing happens with nations. Nations and national economies are buying oil on the world market. Now, inasmuch as the price of oil goes up, they are terrified as well, because they now have to pay a much higher amount of their foreign currency reserves for a given amount of oil. Now, easy to understand that this will have a strangulating effect, in particular on poor countries.
My overriding concern in thinking about the issues that we're facing is the increase in the number of failing states. We all know about some of the failing states: Somalia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, and now Afghanistan, possibly Pakistan, many other countries. The list of failing states is getting longer now each year.
Governments react very differently to the challenge of resource scarcity. And resource scarcity is not that different in its mechanistic way as having, let's say, financial shortages. And so some governments will act more wisely and others will close their eyes and run into the wall.
And in this situation, at some point, the entire global situation could begin to unravel. And that's one of my concerns, that as we face simultaneously oil shortages, food shortages, water shortages, and growing competition for access to these resources, that the system could begin to break down.
I hope that the scarcity of resources will not, and energy resources, will not lead to conflict, because that's a lose-lose situation.
So that is what very often is happening, that